Why did the 5th century Romans rely on barbarian tribes to supply their soldiers and their generals? And how different were the barbarians from the Romans? Was the term barbarian simply a later Roman ethnic slur, which was adopted by historians like Gibbon, who instinctively supported European colonialism? Did the Western Roman Empire truly fall, or did it gradually evolve into the various barbaric kingdoms, which in turn evolved into the modern countries of Europe? And what changed for the inhabitants of the empire after the reign of the last Western Roman emperor? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare, which includes illustrations. Our sister blog includes footnotes, and both include our Amazon book links. Our current Pope has chosen the name of Pope Leo XIV, signaling that he plans to continue the policies of his predecessor, Pope Francis, by honoring the Catholic social justice proclivities of the late 19th century Pope Leo XIII, who issued the groundbreaking encyclical Rerum Novarum, protecting the rights of the working class. Will he also reflect the conservative tendencies of that pope? Time will tell. Was a name chosen by both of these popes also imply that they want to mirror the accomplishments of the first Pope Leo the Great, who marched bravely unarmed into the camp of Attila the Hun, persuading him to refrain from sacking Rome? And how about Pope Leo III, who famously crowned Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor more than 4 centuries later? Now, the story of these early popes also shed light on other misleading impressions many modern believers have about how the relationship between the early church and the Roman Empire evolved. One common misconception is that the church strayed from its pure origins when it became corrupted by secular concerns. We wish to reflect on the true nature of the church under the Roman Empire, and Rome in particular, how the church was compelled to govern when civil authority crumbled, and how the barbarian invasions influenced these trends. Did the church in these early years respond to events it could not control as best she could? Or did the church and the state lose their way, tolerating corruption rather than tending to the needs of the flock? Now, usually we discuss our sources at the end of our reflection, but in this case, understanding the sources help us to evaluate the history. We're using 3 main sources. Edward Gibbon's The History and Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, written at the time of the American Revolution, and Will Durant's Age of Faith, written soon after World War II, depend heavily on the classic historians of the past millennia, while Durant augments this with economic analysis and archaeological discoveries. Now, how well has Gibbon's history aged over the past 2 centuries? The Great Courses Plus is a series of college lectures discussing his history and how it has aged well. Gibbon is quotable, though he uses an exaggerated and verbose style typical of his age. He adopts the anti-clericalism of the French Enlightenment of his time, and has a knee-jerk hostility towards monasticism, although he is quite willing to recognize the courage of believers like Pope Leo the Great. Will Durant shares the goal of many ancient historians. He seeks moral lessons from the history of the past, and is quite quotable, with extensive footnotes. And usually we quote from more ancient sources than modern sources. But here we will quote mainly from these 2 modern sources, in part because the ancient sources are just not that quotable. Peter Brown's more recent histories use later archaeological and scientific discoveries, as well as both classical and modern histories, to ponder whether the fall of Rome was a cataclysmic event, or was a gradual process extending over centuries, or whether Rome fell at all, and perhaps it merely evolved into the beginnings of our modern European states. Now, who were the ancient historians these modern historians used as their sources? The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote the history of the Gauls, which did not cover Attila the Hun's conquests, and included the Eastern Emperor Justinian's later temporary reunification of the Roman Empire. And this history is accessible through public domain internet sites. Procopius is known for a scandalous, exaggerated biography of Justinian. The Byzantine historian Jordanes also wrote a history of the Goths, which used the now lost history of Cassiodorus as a source. Some scholars speculate that this history is a propaganda piece supported by Justinian's court. Both of these histories were written in the 6th century. Gibbons praises the accuracy of Ammianius' history, although most of his histories have been lost. Now, some of the major changes in studying the role of the barbarians in the Roman Empire are understanding the true roles of barbarians in ancient Rome, untangling modern assumptions from our understanding of ancient history, and realizing how truly complex any history of clashing cultures can be. And before we assume that the brigandage in the Roman provinces during the 5th century was a relatively recent occurrence, we must ask the question, was travel in the provinces of ancient Rome ever truly safe? Were the ancient Romans even concerned with ensuring the safety of its rural citizens? Now, one clue is in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, which was set in the Judean province of the Roman Empire. Here are unfortunate travelers robbed and beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. A priest and a Levite pass him by until finally a Samaritan takes care of him. Now today, what would we do if we found a traveler beaten and left for dead on the side of the road? We would call the police. But this is a modern response. The modern criminal justice system evolved over the past 200 or 300 years. In ancient Rome, the government was far more concerned with preventing rebellion and collecting taxes than controlling criminals, although it did seek to drive pirates out of business as they interfered with commerce. Perhaps the rural areas surrounding the towns where local legion veterans settled were somewhat safer. We just do not know. Now, most Roman emperors either sought to expand the Roman Empire through bloody conquest, or they wasted their reigns in riotous and drunken abandon. Hadrian was a rare Roman emperor who chose to tour and consolidate the Roman Empire to address provincial concerns and complaints. In many places he only visited once, so vast was the Roman Empire. The Golden Ass, a 2nd century Roman novel, revealed that brigands ruled the connecting roads even in rural Italy. This novel relates the imagined story of a man mistakenly turned into a donkey by magic, whose traveling band is waylaid by a gang of robbers who prey on helpless rural villagers. If it wasn't safe to travel the countrysides in rural Italy in 2nd century Rome, why would it be surprising that Gaul and Spain would be dangerous places a few centuries later? Which leads us to ask, was the Roman Empire ever truly unified? So rather than ask why society started to unravel in the provinces during the time of the barbarians, we should instead ask, why did the civil disorder in the empire worsen during the time of the barbarians? Now, among the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius' predecessors, Emperor Trajan and Emperor Hadrian were both born in Spain, although they had Italian roots. Afterwards, many Roman emperors were raised up not by the Senate but by their soldiers, and many lacked significant Latin ancestry. The Eastern emperors rarely had Latin roots, and why were they not considered barbarians? What was different about the 3rd and 4th centuries was the evolution of barbarian kingdoms within the borders of the Roman Empire, which reduced the Roman tax base and control. We also know that in the early Roman Empire, Italian senators served as governors in the provinces. We also knew that due to limited communications, the provinces were governed largely independent of Rome. And the provinces only became more independent with the passage of time, although history only hints at the details. In the latter years of the Western Roman Empire, the Mongols and the Huns pushed other barbarian tribes like the Goths and the Vandals westward, where their tribes sought refuge in the Roman Empire. In return for settling remote regions, these barbarians offered soldiers and generals to serve in the Roman military. The German tribes were threatening Italy as early as the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and he accepted Germanic soldiers of tribes who surrendered into the Roman army, which had a smaller percentage of Italian soldiers and officers in each succeeding century. Peter Brown contends, the Roman Empire was not violently breached by barbarian invasions. Rather, between AD 200 and 400, the frontier itself changed. From being a defensive region which kept Romans and barbarians apart, it had become instead an extensive middle ground, in which barbarian and Roman societies were drawn together. And after AD 400, it was the barbarians and no longer the Romans who became the dominant partners in that middle ground. Indeed, after AD 400, barbarian tribes served in the army of the Huns, and barbarians from most of the tribes, including the Huns, served in the Roman armies. Another factor was the prejudice many Romans demonstrated towards their barbarian neighbors in the closing centuries of the historical Western Roman Empire. Often, when Rome promised aids to barbarian tribes who agreed to settle Roman frontiers, the local officials cheated the local barbarians out of the aid they were promised, sometimes stealing it outright, which caused barbarian families to go hungry or starve in their new lands. Out of desperation, often they revolted. And this happened even when the barbarians volunteered to serve in the Roman army. And this reflection has several instances where barbarian Roman generals were murdered out of envious suspicion. Peter Brown notes, the emergence of ethnicity as the basis of a new ruling class in the post-imperial West was exactly the opposite of the process which had led to the formation of a Roman imperial civilization in the first centuries of the empire. Different barbarian groups insisted on their separate identities as Goths, Franks, and Vandals, as did Romans. But it became increasingly difficult to tell Romans and barbarians apart solely by appearance, and often the barbarian regiments in the Roman army often welcomed recruits from other tribes, even native Romans. Although Huns were likely not Christian, most of the other barbarian tribes were Christian, although many belonged to the Arian sect, which many Nicene Roman Christians regarded as heretical. Now, 40 years before Attila met with Pope Leo the Great, the Gothic king Alaric had sacked Rome, a humiliation that last occurred about 800 years previously. Alaric was also a general in the Roman army, whose efforts were neither rewarded nor adequately appreciated. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius had paid these Goths an annual tribute as allies, but his successor discontinued this practice, dismissing his Gothic troops. Why was Rome such a tempting target? By this time, Rome was just another provincial town. It had not been the capital of the Western Roman Empire for a century and a half. The center of power had shifted eastward to Constantinople in today's Turkey. It made more sense for the capital of the Western Roman Empire to be located on the western coast of Italy, accessible to the sea. In AD 286, Emperor Diocletian moved the capital of the Western Roman Empire to today's Milan, near Italy's west coast in the northern Po Valley. In AD 401, Emperor Honorius again moved the capital to Ravenna, a port on the west coast of Italy. Rome was still remembered as the historic capital of the Western Roman Empire and still retained much of the wealth that it accumulated when it was the center of the empire. In his Confession, St. Augustine tells us that when he left Hippo in North Africa as a young man to seek his fortunes, he first went to Rome to begin his teaching career. Later, he served as teacher in the court of the emperor in Ravenna, where he was converted to Christianity after listening to the sermons of the bishop and later Saint Ambrose. Well, Durant explains, the idle Gothic warriors craved money and adventure. Their new leader, Alaric, asked them, why should the proud and virile Goths submit to be hirelings for the effete Romans, instead of using their courage and arms to cut off from the dying empire a kingdom of their own? In AD 401, Alaric's forces invaded Italy, but was defeated by the legendary general Stilicho, who was himself a Vandal warrior. Soon afterwards, the Western Roman Emperor Honorius was convinced that Stilicho was plotting to place his son on the throne, so he had Stilicho, who had defended the Roman Empire for decades, executed. Soon after, he also slaughtered thousands of Stilicho's Vandal followers, including leaders of his barbarian Roman legions. Now, complaining that the promised tribute of 4,000 pounds of gold had not been paid, Alaric marched across the Alps a decade later in AD 410, pillaging several northern Italian cities, and then headed to Rome. The slave opened the city gates to Alaric and his Gothic army. Since Alaric was an Arian Christian, there was not totally indiscriminate slaughter. Well, Durant continues, for 3 days Rome was subjected to an indiscriminate pillage that left the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul untouched, and spared the refugees who sought sanctuary in them. But the Huns and slaves in his army of 40,000 men could not be controlled. Hundreds of rich men were slaughtered. Their women were raped and killed. It was impossible to bury all the corpses that littered the streets. Thousands of prisoners were taken, and doubtless many of them were sold into slavery or ransomed. Durant does not say. Later that year, Alaric died of a fever. His successors founded the Visigothic Kingdom of Gaul, theoretically subject to Rome, but was in reality an independent realm. And now we'll discuss the relationship between the frenemies, Attila the Hun and the Roman general Aetius. The Huns were originally from the steppes of Central Asia. They and the Mongols were likely distinct tribes, although their exact origin is lost in the sands of history. Like the Mongols, they were fierce warriors, skilled at shooting arrows on horseback at full gallop. Historians estimate that they first settled in the Volga River region in Russia around AD 370, pushing the Gothic tribes westward. The Huns settled in Europe to stay, forging relationships with their Roman neighbors, enlisting in the Roman army. During their lifetimes, Attila and Aetius were the most powerful rulers in the Western Roman Empire. Gibbon writes, Attila's alliance with the Romans of the West was cemented by his personal friendship for the great Aetius, who always secure finding in the barbarian camp a hospitable reception and a powerful supporter. Sometimes they were allies, sometimes they were friends. Thus, they were frenemies. When Regillus, the ruler of the Huns, died, his thrones passed to his nephews, Attila and Bleda. Bleeda soon died. Perhaps he was murdered at Attila's orders. Although Attila was a highly effective military leader, so was Aetius. Early in his career, Aetius once commanded Hun troops, but later he fought against his friend Attila and his allies. Attila could field an army of 500,000 men. His loose confederation included not only Huns, but also Ostrogoths, Alans, and Gepids tribesmen. After his death, many of these other tribesmen rejected the rule of his successors. How did Attila and Aetius become frenemies? In his youth, Aetius was an honored hostage of first the Visigoths and then the Huns. Now, in the ancient world, princes were often held hostage as promised in peace treaties, just as princesses were promised in marriage to ensure peace with neighboring kingdoms. These hostage sons were not confined. Instead, they were encouraged to form friendships among the foreigners who furthered their education. As a hostage, Aetius also learned the military ethos of both the Visigoths and Huns during his stay and became a lifelong frenemy of Attila. When the Roman court politics turned against him, he sought refuge among the Huns at least once, which did not prevent him from later defeating Attila in battle. Gibbon describes Aetius as average in height for the time, and his manly limbs were strong, beautiful, and agile. He excelled in managing a horse, drawing a bow, and darting a javelin. He could patiently endure lack of food and sleep with great endurance. He possessed genuine courage that despised not only dangers, but also injuries. And it was impossible to corrupt, deceive, or intimidate the firm integrity of his soul. And the neighboring barbarians respected the faith and valor of the patrician Aetius. Gibbon continues, Aetius assiduously cultivated the alliance of the Huns. While he resided in their tents as a hostage or as an exile, he had familiarly conversed with Attila himself, and the two famous antagonists shared a personal and military friendship, which they afterwards confirmed by mutual gifts, frequent embassies, and the education of Carpilio, the son of Aetius, in the camp of Attila. Now, quite likely, Carpilio was the next generation hostage. Now, did this friendship result in a reduction of the tribute paid by the Western Roman court to Attila? Not hardly. The Gothic historian Jordanes describes Attila. He was haughty in his walk, rolling his eyes hither and thither, so that the power of his proud spirit appeared in the movement of his body. He was indeed a lover of war, yet restrained in action, mighty in counsel, gracious to supplicants, and lenient to those who were once received under his protection. He was short of stature, with a broad chest and a large head. His eyes were small, his beard was thin and sprinkled with gray. He had a flat nose and swarthy complexion, revealing his origin. Well, Durant adds to this overly romantic depiction. Attila differed from the other barbarian conquerors in trusting to cunning more than to force. He ruled by using the heathen superstitions of his people to sanctify his majesty. His victories were prepared by the exaggerated stories of his cruelty, which perhaps he had himself originated. Even his Christian enemies called him the scourge of God, and were so terrified by his cunning that only the Goths could save him. Of course, Attila encouraged the perceptions of his cruelty, but his horrible cruelty could not be easily exaggerated. Durant continues, Attila could neither read nor write, but this did not detract from his intelligence. He was not a savage. He had a sense of honor and justice, and often proved himself more magnanimous than the Romans. Now, Durant seems overly fond of Attila. Attila and the Romans were more like each other than either would admit. Attila lived and dressed simply, which we can believe, but then Durant claims that he ate and drank moderately, which is hard to believe, especially since he drank himself to death. But this description is likely from his sources. Attila's palace was a huge longhouse with elegantly carved or polished wood, reinforced with carpets and skins to keep out the cold. Gibbon notes, after the death of his rival Boniface, the general he fought for control of the Roman army, Aetius had prudently retired to the tents of the Huns. He was indebted to their alliance for his safety and restoration. Instead of the suppliant language of a guilty exile, he solicited his pardon at the head of 60,000 barbarians, which was granted by the fearful Empress Placidia. Gibbon continues, the fortunate Aetius, who was immediately promoted to the rank of patrician and thrice invested with the honors of consulship, assumed, with the title of master of the cavalry and infantry, the whole military power of the state, and he is sometimes styled by contemporary writers the Duke or General of the Romans of the West. His prudence, rather than his virtue, engaged him to leave the grandson of the Eastern Emperor Theodosius in the possession of the purple. Thus, Western Emperor Valentinian III was permitted to enjoy the peace and luxury of Italy, while the patricians appeared in the glorious light of a hero and patriot. who supported for nearly 20 years the ruins of the Western Empire. Durant writes that in AD 444, both the Eastern and Western Roman emperors paid Attila tribute as a bribe to peace, disguising it as payments for services rendered by a client king. Able to put in the field an army of 500,000 men, Attila saw no reason why he should not make himself master of all Europe and the Near East. After his generals and troops crossed the Danube, they captured many cities in the Balkans and threatened Constantinople itself. The city bought peace by raising its yearly tribute from 700 to 2,100 pounds of gold. The Huns then entered Thrace, Thessaly, and Scythia, now southern Russia, sacked 70 towns, enslaving thousands. These Hun raids ruined the Balkans for 4 centuries. The Danube ceased for a long time to be a main avenue of commerce between East and West, and the cities on its banks decayed. Durant continues, having bled the East to his heart's content, Attila turned to the West and found an unusual excuse for war. Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III, having been seduced, became pregnant by one of her chamberlains. She had been banished to a convent in Constantinople, where she reluctantly did penance. Snatching at any plan for escape, she sent her ring to Attila with an appeal for aid. The subtle king, who had his own brand of humor, chose to interpret the ring as a proposal of marriage. He forthwith laid claim to Honoria and to half the Western Empire as her dowry. Attila's real motivation was that Marcian, the new emperor of the East, had refused to continue payment of tribute, and Valentinian had followed his example. What was it like to survive in a city conquered by the Huns? Inhabitants of the city were assembled in a plain outside the city, where they were divided into 3 parts, according to Gibbon. The first class consisted of the soldiers of the garrison, of the young men capable of bearing arms, and their fate was instantly decided. They were either enlisted among the Moguls, or they were massacred on the spot by the troops, who with pointed spears and bended bows had formed a circle around the captive multitude. The second class, composed of the young and beautiful women, of the artificers of every rank and profession, and of the more wealthy or honorable citizens, from whom a private ransom might be expected, were split into proportionate lots. Those who were not ransomed were often sold into slavery. The remainder, whose life or death was of no concern to the conquerors, were permitted to return to the city, which had been stripped of its valuable furniture, and a tax was imposed on those wretched inhabitants for the indulgence of breathing their native air. A primary source of slaves in the ancient world was through military raids, although many slaves were born into their condition. The ancient Greeks, ancient Jews, and Romans in the early days of the empire employed similar brutal tactics in capturing slaves and concubines. Attila then invaded Gaul or modern-day France. The Huns were more brutal than the armies of the other barbarian chieftains. Durant states that Theodoric, aged king of the Visigoths, came to the rescue of the empire. He joined the Romans under Aetius and the enormous armies met in one of the bloodiest battles in history. 162,000 men are said to have died there, including the heroic Gothic king. The victory of the West was indecisive. Attila retreated in good order, and the victors were too exhausted or too divided in policy to pursue him. Durant continues. In the following year, Attila invaded Italy. One town was destroyed, several others merely defeated. Milan was spared with massive tribute. The road to Rome was now open to Attila. Aetius had too small an army to offer substantial resistance. Durant observes, Valentinian III fled to Rome, and then sent to the Hun king a delegation composed of Pope Leo I and 2 senators. No one knows what happened at the ensuing conference. Leo was an imposing figure and received most of the credit for the bloodless victory. History only shows that Attila retreated. Plague had broken out in his army, food was running short, and Marcian was sending in reinforcements from the east. Durant notes, Attila marched his horde back over the Alps to his Hungarian capital, threatening to return to Italy in the next spring unless Honoria should be sent to him as his bride. Meanwhile, he consoled himself by adding to his harem a young lady named Ildiko. He celebrated the wedding with an unusual indulgence in food and drink. On the morrow, he was found dead in bed beside his young wife. He had burst a blood vessel, and the blood in his throat had choked him to death. Durant continues. His realm was divided among his sons, who proved incompetent to preserve it. Jealousies broke out among them. The subject tribes refused their allegiance to a disordered leadership, and within a few years the empire that had threatened to subdue the Greeks and the Romans and the Germans and the Gauls and to put the stamp of Asia upon the face and soul of Europe had broken to pieces and melted away. Now Attila was powerful, ruthless, and terrifying, but unlike Alexander the Great, His armies were at least fought to a draw several times. They failed to breach the walls of Constantinople, and they fought to a draw in the bloody battle in Gaul. Both Rome and the Huns knew the military tactics of the other, and although Attila was greatly feared, his armies were not seen as invincible. But Attila posed the greatest threat to the Roman Empire during his lifetime. Once the danger had passed, another emperor executed the barbarian general who had saved the Western Roman Empire. Well, Durant tells us, Emperor Valentinian III had no son and resented the desire of Aetius to espouse his son to Valentinian's daughter Eudocia. In a mad seizure of alarm, the emperor sent for Valentinian and slew him with his own hand. A member of his court warned Valentinian, "Sire, you have cut off your right hand with your left." A few months later, Valentinian was slain in a palace intrigue. The next year, a mere 3 years after Attila turned away from the walls of Rome, the Vandal king Genseric set sail from Carthage to Ostia, a port near Rome, possibly at the invitation of Valentinian's widow. Will Durant tells us this sad tale. Only an unarmed pope, accompanied by his local clergy, barred his way between Ostia and Rome. Leo was not able this time to dissuade the conqueror, but secured a pledge against massacre, torture, and fire. For 4 days, the city was surrendered to pillage. Christian churches were spared, but all the surviving treasures of the temples were taken to Vandal galleys. The gold tables, the 7-branched candlesticks, and other sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, brought to Rome by Titus 4 centuries before, were included in the spoils. All precious metals, ornaments, and furniture in the imperial palace were removed, and whatever remained of value in the homes of the rich. Thousands of captives were enslaved. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children. Now we want to ask the question, did Rome fall, or did Rome fade away? Valentinian III had ruled as emperor for 30 years, leaving the Western Roman Empire in a weakened state. As was typical after an emperor was murdered, many emperors succeeded Valentinian. 9 emperors in 21 years, some serving a few months, others serving up to 4 years. Often the Roman generals were more powerful than the emperors, and Rome was again sacked in AD 472. The barbarian king Odoacer deposed and pensioned off the child emperor Romulus Augustus in AD 476, setting the imperial standards of Rome to the Eastern Roman emperor Zeno. Well, Durant tells us that the cowed Roman Senate offered Zeno sovereignty over all the empire, provided that Odoacer serve as his patricius in governing Italy. Zeno consented, and the line of Western emperors came to an end. Now, at the time, no one saw this as the fall of Rome. Instead, contemporaries saw it as the reunification of the Roman Empire. The Germanization of the Italian army, government, and peasantry, and the natural multiplication of Germans in Italy had proceeded so long that the political consequences seemed to be negligible shifts on the surface of the national scene. Odoacer ruled Italy as a king, with small regard for Zeno. And the Roman Senate, which was already a weak institution in the late Republic, had declined under the emperors. After the reforms of Diocletian, the Roman Senate survived purely as a local institution. The Roman Senate continued to function under Odoacer and his successors, and was somewhat restored after the Eastern Emperor Justinian temporarily reconquered much of the Western Roman Empire in AD 554. What can we conclude? That history is complex, particularly when various peoples and traditions mix in unexpected ways. The view that the Western Roman Empire fell to barbarian attacks is absurdly simplistic and misleading. The barbarians had integrated so deeply into Roman society and the Roman army, and had adopted so many Roman customs that they were often indistinguishable from Romans. Their tribal settlements were often what distinguished them from Romans. Indeed, the later emperors depended on the barbarian generals Stilicho and Aetius to defend the late Western Roman Empire. They weakened their defenses when they assassinated these leading generals and when they became jealous of their power. General Aetius's armies defending the empire often contained a sizable contingent of Huns. And Attila the Hun had been a frenemy with Aetius since childhood and had extensive contacts outside of warfare with his Roman neighbors. There were several quasi-independent barbarian kingdoms inside the borders of Rome. These factors meant that the many battles during the dying days of the Western Roman Empire were more like an internal civil war than an external invasion. When searching for images for this reflection, we discovered this icon of Saint Servatius baptizing Attila the Hun. If this did happen, it certainly did not cure his bloodthirstiness. Since by this time many barbarians had been Christians for generations, we can assume that Attila was familiar with Christianity, and that may have been a factor in his respect for the courageous entreaties of Pope Leo the Great for him to refrain from sacking Rome. And we can also conclude that the growing civil responsibilities that the Roman Pope was assuming were due to necessity, since the city of Rome was no longer a capital city at the center of the empire, but was merely a backwater provincial city which was no longer effectively protected by the empire. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.